secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings.
I think a new world order is emerging.
An inside job? How dare you? How dare you?
To create, so to say, mass-produced models of human beings arranged in some kind of a scientific caste system.
We shall go on to the end. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall never surrender.
Good morning, everybody. This is UCY.tv with the Solvinur event. Check it out at UCY.tv. Also check out the website reallibertymedia.com. You have a nice list up there with all kinds of channels you can choose from. And freedomsnetwork.com. The alternative to Facebook. Welcome everybody. Today we're going to be continuing with Brave New World. This will be the third episode. I've got some coffee here and I'm gonna roll me a ciggy. How you doing everybody in the chat room? There's already a couple of people there at ucy.tv. You can find the chat link. Cracker, good morning. And Hopper, Lone Frog, and Coffee Cup. Hello, never seen you before. Welcome. Matty Clues. Surely you're just the improved version. And the Ocelli effect. Welcome everybody. Let's see here. Where did I leave it? Here it is. Check out the website also. Ocelli.com. You guys know him, Chuck Ocelli. OCHELLI.com. Looks slick. Looks good, buddy. Well done. All right. So it's half rainy, half sunshiny here in the Netherlands or Holland. And that's typical Dutch weather. We used to have that back in the 70s also. And the 80s, and in my memory, in the 90s, is that you could have like in the morning it would rain, and then at 10 o'clock you had sunshine, and then at 12 o'clock it would rain, and then at 3 o'clock you had sunshine, and it would just keep on going like that. It's a really strange, very fast pace of changing weather, and we were used to that. It happened. We called it Dutch weather because when I went to Canada, I noticed that when it's raining, and it's going to keep raining for a while. You know, I have periods of 3 weeks of rain, and it seemed to be normal over there. So, and then you had whole weeks of sunshine, which was like that's unheard of here in the Netherlands. It's never in my memory. I can only remember one period of like 5 or 6 weeks of rain after another. And weeks of pure sunshine also, and that was then in the summer, but not every summer is like that because we have got a sea climate. Talk about climate change, right? We have in the Netherlands what's called a sea climate, as opposed to a desert climate or a land climate or whatever. There's all kinds of climate. And in the sea climate, there's in the summer more moisture than there is in the winter, so that's coming down, right? More, what you call that? Not moisture, but precipitation, I think, something like that. And so you don't expect long periods of sunshine, right? All right. Let's see, my ciggy is ready, so we can almost get started. You can also join me, if you like. If you have Skype, then you can contact me, Solvinur, Solvinur. And the last page I'm going to mention is Freedom Palooza. And yeah, it's probably best to do that in Google, because if I do it, I go to a Dutch site, freedompalooza.blogspot.nl, but it's probably working for freedompalooza.blogspot.us will probably also work. Check it out. They're coming 4th of July. And a couple of acts like The Tank and Poker Face, Miners Keepers, Trevor Laborite, something, Doug Hawk, and more to come. So check it out. They also have a YouTube channel where you can follow it. Freedom Palooza coming up, guys. All right. There we go. Ta-da! We're all set. If you have any questions in the chat, you can paste them. I try and keep an eye on them while I read on. And this is where we left off last week. So, picking it up in the middle of, I don't know, I think chapter 3 or 4, I'm not sure. I love new clothes. I love new clothes. I love... this is about sleep teaching, I think, right? So essential when there was underproduction, but in an age of machines and the fixation of nitrogen positively a crime against society. Oh no, this is not about sleep teaching. Henry Foster gave it me. All crosses had their tops cut and became T's. There was also a thing called God. It's real Morocco surrogate. I can't... I cannot not comment on that. It's real Morocco surrogate. In Dutch we say echt nep. It's used as a joke. Real but not real, right? Like surrogate. We have the World State now and Ford's Day celebrations and community sings and solidarity services. All right, again, I can't stop from commenting again. This is strange. And now I'm talking about reality now, right? What's happening in society today here in the Netherlands. Talking about solidarity services, which could be just another word for participation. Right? And, well, what do you know? We have now, since January 15, a participation law. Which means, if you're out of job, you will get contacted and they will want you to show up. And if you don't show up, they threaten you with consequences. Most people that do not have a job are relying on handouts from the government, and that's what they're threatening them with then. And then you come up and you have to have a talk with these people from the Center for Work, I would just translate it as. And I ask you questions about how you doing and what do you like to do? What are you doing at the moment? Do you do any, in Dutch it's vrijwilligerswerk. I don't know how to translate that in English. It's when you do something for free, you work for free, but it's usually tied to some community thing or something. And so they want to know everything about you, and you have to fill out this form, 50 questions with likes and dislikes. And out comes of the computer rolls a whole list of things to do for you. See? That's how it works in the Netherlands. So continuing. Ford, how I hate them, Bernard Marx was thinking. There was a thing called heaven, but all the same they used to drink enormous quantities of alcohol. Like meat, like so much meat. There was a thing called the soul and a thing called immortality. Do ask Henry where he got it. But they used to take morphia and cocaine. And what makes it worse, she thinks of herself as meat. That's probably thinks. Misprint there. 2,000 pharmacologists and biochemists were subsidized in AP 178. He does look glum, said the assistant predestinator, pointing at Bernard Marx. 6 years it was being produced commercially, the perfect drug. Let's bait him. Euphoric, narcotic, pleasantly hallucinant. Glum, Marx, glum. The clap on the shoulder made him start. Look up. It was that brute Henry Foster. What you need is a gram of soma. All the advantages of Christianity and alcohol, none of their defects. Ford, I should like to kill him. But all he did was to say, no thank you, and fend off the proffered tube of tablets. Take a holiday from reality whenever you like, and come back without so much as a headache or a mythology. Take it, insisted Henry Foster, take it. Stability was practically assured. 1 cubic centimeter cures 10 gloomy sentiments, said the assistant predestinator, citing a piece of homely hypnopedic wisdom. It only remained to conquer old age. Damn you, shouted Bernard Marx. Hoity-toity. Gonadal hormones, transfusion of young blood, magnesium salts. And do remember that a gram is better than a dam. They went out laughing. All the psychological stigmata of old age have been abolished, and along with them, of course. Don't forget to ask him about that Malthusian belt, said Fanny. Along with them, all the old man's mental peculiarities. Characters remain constant throughout a whole lifetime. 2 rounds of obstacle golf to get through before dark. I must fly. Work. Play at 60-hour powers and tastes are what They were at 17. Poof. Old men in the bad old days used to renounce, retire, take to religion, spend their time reading, thinking. Idiots, swine, Bernard Marx was saying to himself as he walked down the corridor to the lift. Now, such in progress, the old men work, the old men copulate, the old men have no time, no leisure from pleasure, not a moment to sit down and think, or if ever by some unlucky chance such a crevice of time should yawn in the solid substance of their distractions, there is always soma, delicious soma, half a gram for a half holiday, a gram for a weekend, 2 grams for a trip to the gorgeous East, 3 for a dark eternity on the moon, returning whence they find themselves on the other side of the crevice, safe on the solid ground of daily labor and distraction, scampering from feelie to feelie, from girl to pneumatic girl, from electromagnetic golf course to... "Go away, little girl," shouted the DHC angrily. "Go away, little boy. Can't you see that his Ford ship's busy? Go and do your erotic play somewhere else." "Suffer, little children," said the controller. Slowly, majestically, with a faint humming of machinery, the conveyors moved forward, 33 centimeters an hour. In the red darkness glinted innumerable rubies. And that was the end of chapter 3. So we're on to chapter 4. Ta-da! So, chapter 4. The lift was crowded with men from the Alpha changing rooms, and Lenina's entry was greeted by many friendly nods and smiles. She was a popular girl and, at one time or another, had spent the night with almost all of them. They were dear boys, she thought, as she returned their salutations. Charming boys. Still, she did wish that George Edsall's ears weren't quite so big. Perhaps he'd been given just a spot too much parathyroid at meter 328? And looking at Benito Hoover, she couldn't help remembering that he was really too hairy when he took his clothes off. Turning, with eyes a little saddened by the recollection of Benito's curly blackness, she saw in a corner the small, thin body, the melancholy face of Bernard Marx. "Bernard!" She stepped up to him. "I was looking for you." Her voice rang clear above the hum of the mounting lift. The others looked round curiously. "I wanted to talk to you about your new Mexico plan." Out of the tail of her eyes she could see Benito Hoover gaping with astonishment. The gape annoyed her. "Surprised I shouldn't be begging to go with him again," she said to herself. Then aloud, and more warmly than ever, "I'd simply love to come with you for a week in July," she went on. Anyhow, she was publicly proving her unfaithfulness to Henry. Fanny ought to be pleased, even though it was Bernard. That is, Lenina gave him her most deliciously significant smile. "If you still want to have me." Bernard's pale face blushed. What on earth for? She wondered, astonished, but at the same time touched by his strange tribute to her power. Hadn't we better talk about it somewhere else? He stammered, looking horribly uncomfortable. As though I'd been saying something shocking, thought Lenina. He couldn't look more upset if I'd made a dirty joke, asked him who his mother was or something like that. Yeah. I mean, with all these people about, he was choked with confusion. Lenina's laugh was frank and wholly unmalicious. How funny you are, she said, and she quite genuinely did think him funny. You'll give me at least a week's warning, won't you? She went on in another tone. I suppose we take the blue Pacific rocket? Does it start from the Charing T Tower, or is it from Hampstead? Before Bernard could answer, the lift came to a standstill. Roof, called a creaking voice. The liftman was a small simian creature, dressed in the black tunic of an Epsilon minus semi-moron. Roof. He flung open the gates. The warm glory of afternoon sunlight made him start and blink his eyes. Oh, Roof, he repeated in a voice of rapture. He was as though suddenly and joyfully awakened from a dark, annihilating stupor. Roof. He smiled up with a kind of doggedly expectant adoration into the faces of his passengers. Talking and laughing together, they stepped out into the light. The liftman looked after them. Roof? He said once more, questioningly. Then a bell rang, and from the ceiling of the lift a loudspeaker began, very softly and yet very imperiously, to issue its commands. Go down, it said. Go down. Floor 18. Go down. Floor 18. The liftman slammed the gates, touched the button, and instantly dropped back into the droning twilight of the well, the twilight of his own habitual stupor. It was warm and bright on the roof. The summer afternoon was drowsy with the hum of passing helicopters, and the deeper drone of the rocket planes hastening, invisible, through the bright sky 5 or 6 miles overhead, was like a caress on the soft air. Bernard Marx drew a deep breath. He looked up into the sky and round the blue horizon, and finally down into Lenina's face. Yeah. In Huxley's book, even Huxley says we used to have blue horizon, right? Isn't it beautiful? His voice trembled a little. She smiled at him with an expression of the most sympathetic understanding. Simply perfect for obstacle golf, she answered rapturously. And now I must fly, Bernard. Henry gets cross if I keep him waiting. Let me know in a good time about the date. And waving her hand, she ran away across the wide flat roof towards the hangars. Bernard stood watching the retreating twinkle of the white stockings, the sunburned knees vivaciously, no clue guys, bending and unbending again, and the softer rolling of those well-fitted corduroy shorts beneath the bottle green jacket. His face wore an expression of pain. I should say he was pretty, said a loud and cheery voice just behind him. Bernard started and looked around. The chubby red face of Benito Hoover was beaming down at him, beaming with manifest cordiality. Benito was notoriously good-natured. People said of him that he could have got through life without ever touching Soma. The malice and bad tempers from which other people had to take holidays never afflicted him. Reality for Benito was always sunny. Pneumatic too, and how? Then, in another tone, "But I say," he went on, "you do look glum. What you need is a gram of Soma." Diving into his right-hand trouser pocket, Benito produced a phial. 1 cubic centimeter cures 10 gloomy, but I say. Bernard had suddenly turned and rushed away. Benito stared after him. What can be the matter with that fellow? He wondered, and, shaking his head, decided that the story about the alcohol having been put into the poor chap's blood surrogate must be true. Touched his brain, I suppose. He put away the Soma bottle and, taking out a packet of sex hormone chewing gum, stuffed a plug into his cheek and walked slowly away towards the hangars, ruminating. Henry Foster had had his machine wheeled out of its lockup, and when Lenina arrived was already seated in the cockpit, waiting. 4 minutes late, was always his comment as she climbed in beside him. He started the engines and threw the helicopter screws into gear. The machine shot vertically into the air. Henry accelerated. The humming of the propeller shrilled from hornet to wasp, from wasp to mosquito. The speedometer showed that they were rising at the best part of 200 kilometers a minute. London diminished beneath them. The huge table-topped buildings were no more in a few seconds than a bed of geometrical mushroom sproutings from the green park and garden. In the midst of them, thin-stalked, a taller, slenderer fungus. The Charing Tea Tower had lifted towards the sky a disk of shining concrete. Like the vague tortoise of fabulous athletes, huge, fleshy clouds lolled on the blue air above their heads. Out of one of them suddenly dropped a small scarlet insect, buzzing as it fell. "There's the red rocket," said Henry, "just come in from New York." Looking at his watch. 7 minutes behind time, he added, and shook his head. These Atlantic services, they're really scandalously unpunctual. He took his foot off the accelerator. The humming of the screws overhead dropped an octave and a half, back through wasp and hornet to bumblebee, to cockchafer, to stag beetle. The upward rush of the machine slackened off. A moment later they were hanging motionless in the air. Henry pushed at a lever. There was a click. Slowly at first, and faster, till it was a circular mist before their eyes. The propeller in front of them began to revolve. The wind of a horizontal speed whistled even more shrilly in the stays. Henry kept his eye on the revolution counter. When the needle touched the 1200 mark, he threw the helicopter screws out of gear. The machine had enough forward momentum to be able to fly on its planes. Lenina looked down through the window in the floor beneath her feet. They were flying over the 6-kilometer zone of parkland that separated central London from its first ring of satellite suburbs. The green was maggoty with foreshortened life. Forest of centrifugal bumble-poppy towers gleamed between the trees. Near Shepherd's Bush, 2,000 beta-minus mixed doubles were playing Riemann surface tennis. A double row of escalator 5 courts lined the main road from Nothing Hill to Willesden. In the Ealing Stadium, a Delta gymnastic display and community sing was in progress. "What a hideous color khaki is," remarked Lenina, voicing the hypnopathic prejudices of her caste. The building of the Hounslow Feely studio covered 7.5 hectares. Near them, a black and khaki army of laborers was busy revitrifying the surface of the Great West Road. One of the huge traveling crucibles was being taped as they flew over. The molten stone poured out in a stream of dazzling incandescence across the road. The asbestos rollers came and went. At the tail, an insulated watering cart, the steam rose in white clouds. At Brentford, the television corporation's factory was like a small town. "They must be changing the shift," said Lenina. Like aphids and ants, the leaf-green gamma girls, the black semi-morons, swarmed around the entrances or stood in queues to take their place in the monorail tram cars. Mulberry-colored beta-minuses came out and went among the crowd. The roof of the main building was alive with the alighting and departure of helicopters. "My word," said Lenina, "I'm glad I'm not a gamma." 10 minutes later, they were at Stoke Poges and had started their first round of obstacle golf. Paragraph 2. I think it's the first time we come across a paragraph. Hold on, guys. So, with eyes for the most part downcast and, if ever they lighted on a fellow creature, at once and furtively averted, Bernard hastened across the roof. He was like a man pursued, but pursued by enemies he does not wish to see, lest they should seem more hostile even than he had supposed, and he himself be made to feel guiltier and even more helplessly alone. That horrible Benito Hoover, and yet the man had meant well enough, which only made it, in a way, much worse. Those who meant well behaved in the same way as those who meant badly. Even Lenina was making him suffer. He remembered those weeks of timid indecision, during which he had looked and longed and despaired of ever having the courage to ask her. Dared he face the risk of being humiliated by a contemptuous refusal? But if she were to say yes, what rapture! Well, now she had said it, and he was still wretched. Wretched that she should have thought it such a perfect afternoon for obstacle golf, that she should have trotted away to join Henry Foster, that she should have found him funny for not wanting to talk of their most private affairs in public. Wretched, in a word, because she had behaved as any healthy and virtuous English girl ought to behave, and not in some other abnormal, extraordinary way. He opened the door of his lockup and called to a lounging couple of Delta minus attendants to come up and push his machine out onto the roof. The hangars were staffed by a single Bokanovsky group, and the men were twins, identically small, black and hideous. Bernard gave his orders in the sharp, rather arrogant and even offensive tone of one who does not feel himself too secure in his superiority. To have dealings with members of the lower caste was always for Bernard a most distressing experience, for whatever the cause, and the current gossip about the alcohol in his blood, surrogate, may very likely, for accidents will happen, have been true. Bernard's physique as hardly better than that of an average gamma. He stood 8 centimeters short of the standard alpha height and was slender in proportion. Contact with members of the lower castes always reminded him painfully of the physical inadequacy. I am I, and I wish I wasn't. His self-consciousness was acute and stressing. Each time he found himself looking on the level instead of downward into a delta face, he felt humiliated. Would the creature treat him with no respect due to his caste? The question haunted him, not without reason, for gammas, deltas, and epsilons had been to some extent conditioned to associate corporeal mass with social superiority. Indeed, a faint hypnopathic prejudice in favor of size was universal. Hence the laughter of the women to whom he made proposals, the practical joking of his equals among the men. The mockery made him feel an outsider, and feeling an outsider, he behaved like one, which increased the prejudice against him and intensified the contempt and hostility aroused by his physical defects, which in turn increased his sense of being alien and alone. Let me light my cigarette, guys. So, a chronic fear of being slighted made him avoid his equals, made him stand where his inferiors were concerned, self-consciously of his dignity. How bitterly he envied men like Henry Foster and Benito Hoover, men who never had to shout at an epsilon to get an order obeyed, men who took their position for granted, men who moved through the caste system as a fish through water, so utterly at home as to be unaware either of themselves or of the beneficent and comfortable element in which they had their being. Slackly, it seemed to him, and with reluctance, the twin attendants wheeled his plane out on the roof. "Hurry up," said Bernard irritably. One of them glanced at him. Was that a kind of bestial derision that he detected in those blank grey eyes? "Hurry up," he shouted more loudly, and there was an ugly rasp in his voice. He climbed into the plane and a minute later was flying southwards toward the river. The various bureaus of propaganda and the College of Emotional Engineering were housed in a single 60-story building in Fleet Street. In the basement and on the low floors were the presses and offices of the 3 great London newspapers: the Hourly Radio, an uppercast sheet, the pale green Gamma Gazette, and on khaki paper, and in words exclusively of one syllable, the Delta Mirror. Then came the Bureau of Propaganda by television, by feeling picture, and by synthetic voice and music, respectively 22 floors of them. Above were the search laboratories and the padded rooms in which soundtrack writers and synthetic composers did their delicate work. The top 18 floors were occupied the College of Emotional Engineering. Bernard landed on the roof of Propaganda House and stepped out. "Ring down to Mr. Helmholtz Watson," he ordered the Gamma Plus porter, "and tell him that Mr. Bernard Marx is waiting for him on the roof." He sat down and lit a cigarette. That's a good idea. Helmholtz Watson was writing when the message came down. "Tell him I'm coming at once," he said, and hung up the receiver. Then, turning to his secretary, "I'll leave you to put my things away." He went on in the same official and impersonal tone, and, ignoring her lustrous smile, got up and walked briskly to the door. He was a powerfully built man, deep-chested. Wow, what does my brain do with these words? Deep-chested, broad-shouldered, massive, and yet quick in his movements, springy and agile. The round, strong pillar of his neck supported a beautifully shaped head. His hair was dark and curly, his features strongly marked. In a forcible, emphatic way, he was handsome and looked at his secretary, as his secretary was never tired of repeating, every centimeter an alpha plus. By profession, he was a lecturer at the College of Emotional Engineering, brackets open, Department of Writing, brackets close. And the intervals of his educational activities, a working emotional engineer. He wrote regularly for the Hourly Radio, composed Feely scenarios, and had the happiest knack for slogans and hypnopedic rhymes. Able was the verdict of his superiors. Perhaps a little too able. And it's brackets open. Perhaps, brackets open, and they would shake their heads with significantly lower voices. A little too able. Yes, a little too able. They were right. A mental access had produced in Helmholtz Watson effects very similar to those which, in Bernard Marx, were the result of a physical defect. Too little bone and brawn had isolated Bernard from his fellow man, and the sense of his apartness, being, by all the current standards, a mental excess, became in its turn a cause of wider separation. That which had made Helmholtz so uncomfortably aware of being himself and all alone was too much ability. What the two men had shared was the knowledge that they were individuals. But whereas the physically defective Bernard had suffered all his life from the consciousness of being separate, it was only quite recently that, grown aware of his mental access, Helmholtz Watson had also become aware of his difference from the people who surrounded him. This escalator squash champion, this indefatigable lover, it was said that he had 640 different girls in under 40 years, this admirable committeeman and best mixer had realized quite suddenly that sport, women, communal activities were only, so far as he was concerned, second bests. Really, and at the bottom, he was interested in something else. But in what? That was the problem which Bernard had come to discuss with him, or rather, since it was always Helmholtz who did all the talking, to listen to his friend discussing yet once more. Chup. 3 charming girls from the Bureau of Propaganda, by synthetic voice, waylaid him as he stepped out of the lift. "Oh, Helmholtz, darling, do come and have a picnic supper with us on Exmoor." They clung round him imploringly. He shook his head. He pushed his way through them. No, we're not inviting any other man." But Helmholtz remained unshaken even by his delightful promise. "No," he repeated, "I'm busy," and he held resolutely on his course. The girls trailed after him. It was not till he had actually climbed into Bernard's plane and slammed the door that they gave up pursuit. Not without reproaches. "These women," he said, as the machine rose into the air. "These women." And he shook his head. He frowned. "Too awful." Bernard hypocritically agreed, wishing, as he spoke the words, that he could have as many girls as Helmholtz did, and with as little trouble. He was seized with a sudden urgent need to boast. "I'm taking Lenina Crown to New Mexico with me," he said in a tone as casual as he could make it. "Are you?" said Helmholtz, with a total absence of interest. Then, after a little pause, "This last week or two," he went on, "I've been cutting all my committees, and all my girls." Aha, committees. You can't imagine what a hullabaloo they've been making about it at the college. Still, it's been worth it, I think. The effects, he hesitated, well, they're odd. They're very odd. A physical shortcoming could produce a kind of mental access. The process, it seemed, was reversible. Mental access could produce, for its own purposes, the voluntary blindness and deafness of deliberate solitude, the artificial impotence of asceticism. Ascetism, I think. Ascetic. The rest of the short flight was accomplished in silence. When they had arrived and were comfortably stretched out on the pneumatic sofas in Bernard's room, Helmholtz began again. Speaking very slowly, Did you ever feel, he asked, as though you had something inside you that was only waiting for you to give it a chance to come out? Some sort of extra power that you aren't using, like all the water that goes down the falls instead of through the turbines. He looked at Bernard questioningly. You mean all the emotions one might be feeling if things were different? Helmholtz shook his head. Not quite. I'm thinking of a queer feeling I sometimes get. A feeling that I've got something important to say and the power to say it, only I don't know what it is, and I can't make any use of the power. If there was some different way of writing, or else something else to write about. He was silent. Then, you see, he went on at last, I'm pretty good at inventing phrases, the sorts of words that suddenly make you jump, almost as though you'd sat on a pin. They seem so new and exciting even though they're about something hypnopathically obvious. But that doesn't seem enough. It's not enough for the phrases to be good. What you make with them ought to be good too. But your things are good, Helmholtz. Oh, as far as they go, Helmholtz shrugged his shoulders. But they go such a little way. They aren't important enough somehow. I feel I could do something much more important. Yes, and more intense. More violent. But what? What is there more important to say? And how can one be violent about the sort of things one's expected to write about? Words can be like X-rays. If you use them properly, they'll go through anything. You read and you're pierced. That's one of the things I try to teach my students, how to write piercingly. But what on earth's the good of being pierced by an article about the community sing, or the latest improvement in scent organs? Besides, can you make words really piercing? Like the very hardest X-rays, when you're writing about that sort of thing. Can you say something about nothing? That's what I finally boils down to. I try and I try. Hush, said Bernard suddenly, and lifted a warning finger. They listened. I believe there's somebody at the door, he whispered. Helmholtz got up, tiptoed across the room, and with a sharp, quick movement flung the door wide open. There was, of course, nobody there. I'm sorry, said Bernard, feeling and looking uncomfortably foolish. I suppose I've got things on my nerves a bit. When people are suspicious with you, you start being suspicious with them. He passed his hand across his eyes. He sighed. His voice became plaintive. He was justifying himself. If you knew what I'd had to put up with recently, he said almost tearfully, and the uprush of his self-pity was like a fountain, suddenly released. If you only knew. Helmholtz Watson listened with a certain sense of discomfort. Poor little Bernard, he said to himself, but at the same time he felt rather ashamed for his friend. He wished Bernard would show a little more pride. Scroll, lots of blank, more scroll. 5, there we go, that was the end of 4. Moving on to chapter 5. By 8 o'clock the light was failing. The loudspeaker in the tower of the Stoke Pogues clubhouse began, in a more than human tenor, to announce the closing of the courses. Lenina and Henry abandoned their game and walked back towards the club. From the grounds of the Internal and External Secretion Trust came the lowing of those thousands of cattle which provided, with their hormones and their milk, the raw materials for the great factory at Farnham Royal. An incessant buzzing of helicopters filled the twilight. Every 2.5 minutes a bell and a screech of whistles announced the departure of one of the light monorail trains which carried the lower caste golfers back from their separate courses to the metropolis. Lenina and Henry climbed into their machine and started off. At 800 feet, Henry slowed down the helicopter screws, and they hung for a minute or two poised above the fading landscape. The forest of Burnham Beeches stretched like a great pool of darkness towards the bright shore of the western sky. Crimson at the horizon, the last of the sunset faded, through orange, upwards into yellow, and a pale watery green. Northwards, beyond and above the trees, the internal and external secretions factory glared with a fiercely electric brilliance from every window of its 20 stories. Beneath them lay the buildings of the golf club, the huge lower caste barracks, and on the other side of a dividing wall, the smaller houses reserved for alpha and beta members. The approaches to the monorail station were black with the anti-like pallation of lower caste activity. From under the glass vault a lighted train shot into the open. Following its southeasterly course across the dark plain, their eyes were drawn to the majestic buildings of the Slaw crematorium. For the safety of night flying planes, its 4 tall chimneys were floodlighted and tipped with crimson danger signals. It was a landmark. Why do the smokestacks have those things like balconies around them? Inquired Lenina. Phosphorus recovery, explained Henry telegraphically. On their way up the chimney, the gases go through 4 separate treatments. P2O5 used to go right out of circulation every time they cremated someone. Now they recover over 98% of it, more than 1.5 kilos per adult corpse, which makes the best part of 400 tons of phosphorus every year from England alone. Henry spoke with a happy pride, rejoicing wholeheartedly in the achievement, as though it had been his own. Fine to think we can go on being socially useful even after we're dead, making plants grow. Lenina, meanwhile, had turned her eyes away and was looking perpendicularly downwards at the monorail station. Fine, she agreed, but queer that alphas and betas won't make any more plants grow than those nasty little gammas and deltas and epsilons down there. All men are physiochemically equal, said Henry sententiously. Besides, even epsilons perform indispensable services. Even an epsilon. Lenina suddenly remembered an occasion when, as a little girl at school, she had woken up in the middle of the night and became aware for the first time of the whispering that had haunted all her sleeps. She saw again the beam of moonlight, the row of small white beds, heard once more the soft voice that said, The words were there, unforgotten, unforgettable, and after so many night-long repetitions. Everyone works for everyone else. We can't do without anyone. Even epsilons are useful. We couldn't do without epsilons. Everyone works for everyone else. We can't do without anyone. Lenina remembered her first shock of fear and surprise, her speculations through half a wakeful hour, and then, under the influence of those endless repetitions, the gradual soothing of her mind. The soothing, the smoothing, the stealthy creeping of sleep. I suppose epsilons don't really mind being epsilons, she said aloud. It's 5 o'clock, 1 minute past 5 o'clock in the Netherlands. That means it's 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Welcome everybody, this is the second hour of the Solvinur event at ucy.tv, and you can also hear more radio at rlmradio.xyz, another site. Don't forget, Freedom Palooza is coming. This Freedom Palooza 6 is coming 4th of July. And there's speakers, Merlin Miller, let's see, author of a new book called Eagles Rising, Pete Papaherikles, author of the new book American Racial Powder Keg, AFP web editor Dave Gahary, something like that, doing a full-length feature movie on the USS Liberty. Alright, so that's cool. I'm assuming most of the people have heard of the USS Liberty. If not, turn off the radio, go Google it now. This is at Freedom Palooza 2016. Cindy Steele, wrapping up what's happened to her and Ed Steele in their fight against fraudulent charges by a criminal government. Mark Koernke, bringing us up to date about the militias. And co-host Don Buchner, talking about immigration at the border. Nancy Koernke, speaking about the militia kitchen. Art Larson, bringing us up to date on the latest evil machinations of ZOG. I don't know what that is. Zog. Jim Condit, we will talk about vote fraud and how Donald Trump has to get on top of this now. That's a joke, right? Yeah. Ellie James will be bringing his Eurofolk to the stage and bringing us up to date on all things Zion. Rumor has it that members involved with the making of the movie Vaxxed will be on hand too. A couple of more speakers. Craig Denega, Janice Barcello, Tara Baptista, and many others. Starting Friday night, come back to this main page, freedompalooza.com. Right? Starting Friday night. So that was yesterday? I think so, I don't know, I'm not sure. But there is a live link somewhere for the stream from Freedom Palooza. Thank you, Chuck. Zionist occupied government. ZOG. We learned a new acronym. Starting Friday night, come back to this main page, www.freedompalooza.com, for the UCY streaming link, so you can be a part of it from home if you can't make it to the event. See? And if you then scroll down, Friday's link, it says old link and new link, and I'm guessing the new link is the one we should have. And these were for Freedom Palooza 5. So, I don't know, I'm not quite sure which link we're gonna need to have. JJ, help! What's the video? The YouTube video, or what was it? There's another way to do that, right? I don't remember, but I do remember registering there. Ustream or something. Are you guys on Ustream with the Palooza? Somebody help! JJ, I don't know if you're there, but no, he's not in there. I see Dale, Dan, Grump, Hopper, Lone Frog, Jane, Juana Taco, Coffee Cup, Matty Glues, Chili Jest, and your Chili Effect still there. Alright, so check it out. Let's get back to where we were. Of course they don't. How can they? Though they don't know what it is like being anything else. We would mind, of course, but then we've been differently conditioned. Besides, we start with a different heredity. I'm glad I'm not an epsilon, said Lenina with conviction. And if you were an epsilon, said Henry, your conditioning would have made you no less thankful that you weren't a beta or an alpha. He put his forward propeller into gear and headed the machine towards London. Behind them, in the west, the crimson and orange were almost faded. A dark bank of cloud had crept into the zenith. As they flew over the crematorium, the plane shot upwards on the column of hot air rising from the chimneys, only to fall as suddenly when it passed into the descending chill beyond. What a marvelous switchback, Lenina laughed delightedly. But Henry's tone was almost for a moment melancholy. Do you know what that switchback was? He said. It was some human being finally and definitely disappearing, going up in a squirt of hot gas. It would be curious to know who it was, a man or a woman, an alpha or an epsilon. He sighed. Then, in a resolutely cheerful voice, anyhow, he concluded, there's one thing we can be certain of. Whoever he may have been, he was happy when he was alive. Everybody's happy now. Yes, everybody's happy now, echoed Lenina. They had heard the words repeated 150 times every night for 12 years. Landing on the roof of Henry's 40-story apartment house in Westminster, they went straight down the dining hall. There, in a loud and cheerful company, they ate an excellent meal. Soma was served with a coffee. Lenina took 2.5-gram tablets and Henry 3. At 9:20, they walked across the street to the newly opened Westminster Abbey Cabaret. It was a night almost without clouds, moonless and starry, but of this, on the whole, depressing fact, and Henry were fortunately unaware. Proof. The electric sky signs effectively shut off the outer darkness. Calvin Stopes and his 16 saxophonists. From the facade of the new abbey the giant letters invitingly glared. London's finest scent and color organ. All the latest synthetic music. They entered. The air seemed hot and somehow breathless, with a scent of ambergris and sandalwood. On the domed ceiling of the hall, the color organ had momentarily painted a tropical sunset. The 16 saxophonists were playing an old favorite. It's not saxophone with an A, guys. It's like a sextet, like 16 sextets. I don't know. Or it is expressly spelled with an E, as a sax is supposed to represent some sex organ or something. There ain't no bottle in all the world like that dear little bottle of mine. 400 couples were five-stepping round the polished floor. Lenina and Henry were soon the 401st. The saxophones, now he spells it with an A, the saxophones wailed like melodious cats under the moon, moaned in the alto and tenor registers as though the little death were upon them. Rich with a wealth of harmonics, their tremulous chorus mounted towards a climax, louder and even louder, until at last, with a wave of his hand, the conductors let loose the final shattering note of ether music and blew the 16 merrily human blowers clean out of existence. Thunder in A flat major, and then, in all but silence, in all but darkness, there followed a gradual detergence, a diminuendo sliding gradually through quarter tones, down to a faintly whispered dominant chord that lingered on, while the 5/4 rhythm still pulsed below, charging the darkened seconds with an intense expectancy. And at last expectancy was fulfilled. There was a sudden explosive sunrise, and simultaneously the 16 burst into song. Bottle of mine, it's you I've always wanted. Bottle of mine, why was I ever decanted? Skies are blue inside of you. The weather's always fine, for there ain't no bottle in all the world like that dear bottle of mine. Five-stepping with the other 400 round and round Westminster Abbey, Lenina and Henry were yet dancing in another world, the warm, the richly colored, the infinitely friendly world of Soma Holiday. How kind, how good-looking, how delightfully amusing everyone was. Bottle of mine, it's you I've always wanted. But Lenina and Henry had what they wanted. They were inside, here and now, safely inside with the fine weather, the perennially blue sky. And when, exhausted, the 16 had laid by their saxophones, and the synthetic music apparatus was producing the very latest in slow Malthusian blues. They might have been twin embryos gently rocking together on the waves of a bottled ocean of blood surrogate. Good night, dear friends, good night, dear friends, the loudspeaker veiled their commands in a genial and musical politeness. Good night, dear friends. Obediently, with all the others, Lenina and Henry left the building. The depressing stars had travelled quite some way across the heavens, but though the separating screen of the sky sign had now to a great extent dissolved, the two young people still retained their happy ignorance of the night. Swallowing, half an hour before closing time, that second dose of soma had raised a quite impenetrable wall between the actual universe and their minds. Bottled, they crossed the street. Bottled, they took the lift up to Henry's room on the 28th floor. And yet, bottled as she was, and in spite of that second gram of soma, Lenina did not forget to take all the contraceptive precautions prescribed by the regulations. Years of intensive hypnopedia and, from 12 to 17, Malthusian drill 3 times a week had made the taking of these precautions almost as automatic and inevitable as blinking. "Oh, and that reminds me," she said, as she came back from the bathroom, "Fanny Crown wants to know where you found that lovely green Morocco surrogate cartridge belt you gave me." Another paragraph too. Alternate Thursdays were Bernard's Solidarity Service days. After an early dinner at the Aphrodisium, to which Helmholtz had recently been elected under Rule 2, he took leave of his friend and, hailing a taxi on the roof, told the man to fly to Fortson Community Singery. The machine rose a couple of 100 meters, then headed eastwards, and as it turned, there before Bernard's eyes, gigantically beautiful, was the Singery. Floodlighted, its 320 meters of white Carrara surrogate gleamed with a snowy incandescence over Ludgate Hill. At each of the 4 corners of its helicopter platform, an immense T shone crimson against the night, and from the mouths of 24 vast golden trumpets rumbled a solemn, synthetic music. "Damn, I'm late," Bernard said to himself as he first caught a sight of Big Henry, the Singery clock. And sure enough, as he was paying off his cab, Big Henry sounded the hour. "Ford," sang out an immense bass voice from all the golden trumpets. "Ford, Ford," 9 times. Bernard ran for the lift. The great auditorium for Ford's Day celebrations and other masked community things was at the bottom of the building. Above it, 100 to each floor, were the 7,000 rooms used by solidarity groups for their fortnight services. Bernard dropped down to floor 33, hurried along the corridor, stood hesitating for a moment outside room 3210, then, having wound himself up, opened the door and walked in. Hold on, guys, I need to check something flashing here. Don't know why that's flashing. Thank Ford, he was not the last. 3 chairs of the 12 arranged around the circular table were still unoccupied. He slipped into the nearest of them as inconspicuously as he could, and prepared to frown at the yet later comers whenever they should arrive. turning towards him. "What were you playing this afternoon?" the girl on his left inquired. "Obstacle or electromagnetic?" Bernard looked at her. Fourth, it was Morgana Rothschild, and blushingly had to admit that he had been playing neither. Morgana stared at him with astonishment. There was an awkward silence. Then, pointedly, she turned away and addressed herself to the more sporting man on her left. A good beginning for a solidarity service, thought Bernard miserably, and foresaw himself yet another failure to achieve atonement. If only he had given himself time to look around instead of scuttling for the nearest chair. He could have sat between Fifi Bradlaugh and Jonah Diesel, instead of which he had gone and blindly planted himself next to Morgana. Morgana Ford, those black eyebrows of her, that eyebrow, rather, for they met above the nose. Ford. And on his right was Clara Deterding. True, Clara's eyebrows didn't meet, but she was really too pneumatic. Hold on, guys. I'm going to interrupt this. For Jane has pasted the live link for Freedom Palooza, so check that out and see if it works. In the chat room at ucylobby.chatango.com. Go there now if you want to check that out. Thanks, Jane MC. And on his right was Clara Deterding. True, Clara's eyebrows didn't meet, but she was really too pneumatic, whereas Fifi and Joanna were absolutely right. Plump, blonde, not too large, and it was that great lout, Tom Gawakuchi, who now took the seat between them. The last arrival was Sarojini Engels. "You're late," said the president of the group severely. "Don't let it happen again." Sarojini apologized and slid into her place between Jim Bokanovsky and Herbert Bakunin. The group was now complete, the solidarity circle perfect and without flaw. Men, women, in a ring of endless alternation round the table. 12 of them ready to be made one, waiting to come together, to be fused, to lose their 12 separate identities in a larger being. The president stood up, made the sign of the T, switching on the synthetic music, let loose the soft, indefatigable beating of drums, and the chore of instruments near wind and superstring that plangently repeated the brief and unescapable haunting melody of the first solidarity hymn. Again, and it was not the ear that heard the pulsing rhythm, it was the midriff. The wail and clang of those recurring harmonies haunted not the mind, but the yearning bowels of compassion. The president made another sign of the T and sat down. The service had begun. The dedicated Soma tablets were placed in the center of the table. The loving cup of strawberry ice cream Soma was passed from hand to hand, and, with the formula, "I drink to my annihilation," 12 times quaffed. Then to the accompaniment of the synthetic orchestra, the first solidarity hymn was sung. Fourth, we are 12. O make us one, like drops within the social river. O make us now together run as swiftly as thy shining flivver. 12 yearning stanzas, and then the loving cup was passed a second time. I drink to the greater being was now the formula. All drank. Tirelessly the music played, the drums beat, the crying and clashing of the harmonies were an obsession in the melted bowels. The second solidarity hymn was sung. Come, greater being, social friend, annihilating 12 in one. We long to die, for when we end, our larger life has but begun. Again 12 stanzas, but this time the soma had begun to work. Eyes shone, cheeks were flushed, the inner light of universal benevolence broke out on every face in happy, friendly smiles. Even Bernard felt himself a little melted. When Morgana Rothschild turned and beamed at him, he did his best to beam back, but the eyebrow, the black two-in-one Allah, it was still there. He couldn't ignore it, couldn't, however hard he tried. The melting hadn't gone far enough. Perhaps if he had been sitting between Fifi and Joanna. For the third time the loving cup went round. I drink to the eminence of his coming, said Morgana Rothschild, whose turn it happened to be to initiate the circular rite. Her tone was loud, exultant. She drank and passed the cup to Bernard. I drink to the imminence of his coming, he repeated, with a sincere attempt to feel that the coming was imminent. But the eyebrow continued to haunt him, and the coming, so far as he was concerned, was horribly remote. He drank and handed the cup to Clara Deterding. "It'll be a failure again," he said to himself. "I know it will," but he went on doing his best to beam. The loving cup had made its circuit. Lifting his hand, the President gave a signal. The chorus broke out into the third solidarity hymn. Feel how the greater being comes. Rejoice, and, in rejoicing, die. Melt in the music of the drums. For I am you, and you are I. A verse succeeded verse, the voices thrilled with an ever intenser excitement. The sense of the coming's imminence was like an electric tension in the air. The President switched off the music, and, with the final note of the final stanza, there was absolute silence, the silence of stretched expectancy, quivering and creeping with a galvanic life. The President reached out his hand, and suddenly a voice, a deep, strong voice, more musical than any merely human voice, richer, warmer, more vibrant, with love and yearning and compassion, a wonderful, mysterious, supernatural voice spoke from above their heads. Very slowly. "Oh, Ford, Ford," it said diminishingly and on a descending scale. A sensation of warmth radiated thrillingly out from the solar plexus to every extremity of the bodies of those who listened. Tears came into their eyes, their hearts, their bowels seemed to move within them, as though with an independent life. Forth, they were melting, forth, dissolved. Then, in another tone, suddenly, startlingly, "Listen," trumpeted the voice, "listen." They listened. After a pause, sunk to a whisper, but a whisper somehow more penetrating than the loudest cry. "The feet of the greater being," it went on, and repeated the words. The feet of the greater being. The whisper almost expired. The feet of the greater being are on the stairs. And once more there was silence, and the expectancy, momentarily relaxed, was stretched again. Tauter, tauter, almost to the tearing point. The feet of the greater being. Oh, they had heard them, coming softly down the stairs, coming nearer and nearer down the invisible stairs. The feet of the greater being. And suddenly the tearing point was reached. Her eyes staring, her lips parted. Morgana Rothschild sprang to her feet. "I hear him," she cried, "I hear him." "He's coming," shouted Sarojini Engels. "Yes, he's coming, I hear him." Fifi Bradloff and Tom Kawaguchi rose simultaneously to their feet. Oh, Joanna inarticulately testified. "He's coming," yelled James Bokanovsky. The president leaned forward, and, with a touch, released a delirium of cymbals and blown brass, a fever of tom-tomming. "Oh, he's coming," screamed Clara Deterding. "Aye," and it was as though she were having her throat cut. Feeling that it was time for him to do something, Bernard also jumped up and shouted, "I hear him, he's coming." But it wasn't true. He heard nothing, and for him nobody was coming. Nobody, in spite of the music, in spite of the mounting excitement. But he waved his arms, he shouted with the best of them, and when the others began to jig and stamp and shuffle, he also jigged and shuffled. Round they went, circular procession of dancers. Hold on, guys, I'm gonna roll me a new ciggy here. Round they went, a circular procession of dancers, each with hands on the hips of the dancer preceding, round and round, shouting in unison, stamping to the rhythm of the music with their feet, beating it out with hands on the buttocks in front. 12 pairs of hands beating as one, 12 buttocks slabbily resounding, 12 as one, 12 as one. I hear him coming. The music quickened, faster beat the feet, faster fell the rhythmic hands, and all at once a great synthetic bass boomed out the words which announced the approaching atonement and final consummation of solidarity. The coming of the 12 in one, the incarnation of the greater being. Orgy porgy, it sang, while the tom-toms continued to beat their feverish tattoo. Orgy porgy, Ford and fun, kiss the girls and make them one. Boys at one with girls at peace. Orgy porgy gives release. Orgy porgy, the dancers caught up the liturgical refrain. Orgy porgy, Ford and fun, kiss the girls. And as they sang, the lights began slowly to fade, and at the same time to grow warmer, richer, redder, until, at last, they were dancing in the crimson twilight of an embryo store. Orgy porgy, in their blood-colored and fetal darkness, the dancers continued for a while to circulate, to beat and beat out the indefatigable rhythm. Orgy porgy. Then the circle wavered, broke, fell in partial disintegration on the ring of couches which surrounded, circle enclosing circle, the table and its planetary chairs. Orgy porgy. Tenderly the deep voice crooned and cooed. In the red twilight it was as though some enormous negro dove with hovering benevolently over the now prone or supine dancers. Some of these sentences, phew. They were standing on the roof. Big Henry had just sung 11. The night was calm and warm. Wasn't it wonderful? Said Fifi Bradlove. Wasn't it simply wonderful? She looked at Bernard with an expression of rapture, but of rapture in which there was no trace of agitation or excitement, for to be excited is still to be unsatisfied. Hers was the calm ecstasy of achieved consummation, the peace, not of mere vacant satiety and nothingness, but of balanced life, of energies at rest and in equilibrium. A rich and living peace, for the Solidarity Service had given as well as taken, drawn off only to replenish. She was full, she was made perfect, she was still more than merely herself. Didn't you think it was wonderful? She insisted, looking at Bernard's face with those supernaturally shining eyes. Yes, I thought it was wonderful. He lied and looked away. The sight of her transfigured face was at once an accusation and an ironical reminder of his own separateness. He was as miserably isolated now as he had been when the service began, more isolated by reason of his unreplenished emptiness, his dead satiety, no clue, separate and unatoned, while the others were being fused into the greater being, alone even in Morgana's embrace, much more alone indeed, more hopelessly himself than he had ever been in his life before. He had emerged from that crimson twilight into the common electric glare with a self-consciousness intensified to the pitch of agony. He was utterly miserable, and perhaps her shining eyes accused him, perhaps it was his own fault. Quite wonderful, he repeated, but the only thing he could think of was Morgan's eyebrow. Morgana's. Scroll. Yeah, figured. Chapter 6. We're on to chapter 6, guys. Chapter 6. Odd. Odd was Lenina's verdict on Bernard Marx. So odd, indeed, that in the course of the succeeding weeks she had wondered more than once whether she shouldn't change her mind about the New Mexico holiday and go instead to the North Pole with Bernita Hoover. The trouble was that she knew the North Pole, had been there with George Edsel on the last summer, and what was more, found it pretty grim. Nothing to do, and the hotel too hopelessly old-fashioned. No television laid on in the bedrooms, no scent organ, only the most putrid synthetic music and not more than 25 escalator squash courts for over 200 guests. No, decidedly she couldn't face the North Pole again. Added to which, she had only been to America once before, and even then, how inadequately. A cheap weekend in New York, had it been with Jean-Jacques Habibullah or Bokanovsky Jones. She couldn't remember. Anyhow, it was of absolutely no importance. The prospect of flying west again, and for a whole week, was very uninviting. Whoops. The prospect of flying west again, and for a whole week, was very inviting. Moreover, for at least 3 days of that week, they would be in the Savage Reservation. Not more than half a dozen people in the whole center had ever been inside a Savage Reservation. As an Alpha Plus psychologist, Bernard was one of the few men she knew entitled to a permit. For Lenina, the opportunity was unique, and yet so unique was also Bernard's oddness that she had hesitated to take it, had actually thought of risking the pole again with funny old Benito. At least Benito was normal, whereas Bernard... Alcohol in his blood surrogate was Fanny's explanation of every eccentricity. But Henry, with whom one evening, when they were in bed together, Lenina had rather anxiously discussed her new lover, Henry had compared poor Bernard to a rhinoceros. You can't teach a rhinoceros tricks, he had explained in his brief and vigorous style. Some men are almost rhinoceroses. They don't respond properly to conditioning. Poor devils, Bernard's one of them. Luckily for him, he's pretty good at his job, otherwise the director would never have kept him. However, he added consolingly, I think he's pretty harmless. Pretty harmless, perhaps, but also pretty disquieting. That mania to start with, for doing things in private, which meant, in practice, not doing anything at all. For what was there that one could do in private? Apart, of course, from going to bed, but one couldn't do that all the time. Yes, what was there? Precious little. The first afternoon they went out together was particularly fine. Lenina had suggested a swim at Torquay Country Club, followed by a dinner at the Oxford Union, but Bernard thought there would be too much of a crowd. Then what about a round of electromagnetic golf at St. Andrews? But again, no. Bernard considered that electromagnetic golf was a waste of time. Then what's time for? Asked Lenina in some astonishment. Apparently for going walks in the Lake District. For that was what he now proposed. Land on top of the skidoo and walk for a couple of hours in the heather. Alone with you, Lenina. But Bernard, we shall be alone all night. Bernard blushed and looked away. I meant alone for talking, he mumbled. Talking? But about what? Walking and talking? That seemed a very odd way of spending an afternoon. In the end, she persuaded him, much against his will, to fly over to Amsterdam to see the semi-finals of the Women's Heavyweight Wrestling Championship. In a crowd, he grumbled, as usual. He remained obstinately gloomy the whole afternoon. Wouldn't talk to Lenina's friends, of whom they met dozens in the ice cream Soma bar between the wrestling bouts, and, in spite of his misery, absolutely refused to take the half-gram raspberry sundae, which she pressed upon him. "I'd rather be myself," he said. "Myself and nasty. Not somebody else, however jolly." "A gram in time saves 9, said Lenina, producing a bright treasure of sleep-taught wisdom. Bernard pushed away the offered, I'm thinking, glass impatiently. So what kind of word is that? Proffred? That's the second time it's come up now. Why not just say offered? "Now, don't lose your temper," she said. "Remember, 1 cubic centimeter cues 10 gloomy sentiments." "Oh, for Ford's sake, be quiet," he shouted. Lenina shrugged her shoulders. "A gram is always better than a dam," she concluded with dignity, and drank the sundae herself. On their way back across the channel, Bernard insisted on stopping his propeller and hovering on his helicopter screws within 100 feet of the waves. The weather had taken a change for the worse. A southwesterly wind had sprung up. The sky was cloudy. "Look," he commanded. "But it's horrible," said Lenina, shrinking back from the window. She was appalled by the rushing emptiness of the night, by the black foam-flecked water heaving beneath them, by the pale face of the moon, so haggard and distracted among the hastening clouds. "Let's turn on the radio. Quick!" She reached for the dialing knob on the dashboard and turned it at random. "Skies are blue inside of you," sang 16 tremoloing falsettos. "The weather is always—" Then a hiccough and silence. Bernard had switched off the current. "I want to look at the sea in peace," he said. "One can't even look with that beastly noise going on." "But it's lovely, and I don't want to look." "But I do," he insisted. "It makes me feel as though—" He hesitated, searching for words with which to express himself. "As though I were more me, if you see what I mean. More of my own, not so completely a part of something else. Not just a cell in a social body. Doesn't it make you feel like that, Lenina?" But Lenina was crying. It's horrible, she kept repeating. "And how can you talk like that about not wanting to be a part of the social body? After all, everyone works for everyone else. We can't do without anyone, even epsilons." "Yes, I know," said Bernard derisively. "Even epsilons are useful. So am I, and I damned well wish I weren't." Lenina was shocked by his blasphemy. "Bernard," she protested in a voice of amazed distress, "how can you?" In a different key. "How can I?" he repeated meditatively. "No, the real problem is, how is it that I can't? Or rather, because, after all, I know quite well why I can't. What would it be like if I could, if I were free, not enslaved by my conditioning? But Bernard, you're saying the most awful things. Don't you wish you were free, Lenina? I don't know what you mean. I am free. Free to have the most wonderful time. Everybody's happy nowadays. He laughed. Yes, everybody's happy nowadays. We begin giving the children that at 5. But wouldn't you like to be free to be happy? In some other way, Lenina. In your own way, for example, not in everybody else's way. I don't know what you mean, she repeated. Then, turning to him, oh, do let's go back, Bernard, she besought. I do so hate it here. Don't you like being with me? But of course, Bernard, it's this horrible place. I thought we'd be more together here, with nothing but the sea and moon, more together than in a crowd, or even in my rooms. Don't you understand that? I don't understand anything, she said with decision, determined to preserve her incomprehension intact. Nothing. Least of all, she continued in another tone, why you don't take Soma, and why you have these dreadful ideas of yours. You'd forget all about them. And instead of feeling miserable, you'd be jolly, so jolly. She repeated and smiled, for all the puzzled anxiety in her eyes, with what was meant to be an inviting and voluptuous cajolery. He looked at her in silence, his face unresponsive and very grave, looked at her intently. After a few seconds, Lenina's eyes flinched away. She uttered a nervous laugh, tried to think of something to say and couldn't. The silence prolonged itself. When Bernard spoke at last, it was in a small, tired voice. All right then, he said, we'll go back, and stepped hard on the accelerator. He sent the machine rocketing up in the sky. At 4,000, he started his propeller. They flew in silence for a minute or two. Then suddenly Bernard began to laugh. Rather oddly, Lenina thought, but still it was laughter. Feeling better? She ventured to ask. For answer, he lifted one hand from the controls and, slipping his arms around her, began to fondle her breasts. Thank Ford, she said to herself. He's all right again. Half an hour later, they were back in his rooms. Bernard swallowed 4 tablets of Soma at a gulp, turned on the radio and television and began to undress. Well, Lenina inquired with significant archness when they met next afternoon on the roof. Did you think it was fun yesterday? Bernard nodded. They climbed into the plane. A little jolt and they were off. Everyone says I'm awfully pneumatic, said Lenina reflectively, patting her own legs. Awfully. But there was an expression of pain in Bernard's eyes. Like meat, he was thinking. She looked up with a certain anxiety. But you don't think I'm too plump, do you? He shook his head, like so much meat. You think I'm all right? Another nod. In every way? Perfect, he said aloud. And, inwardly, she thinks of herself that way. She doesn't mind being meat. Lenina smiled triumphantly, but her satisfaction was premature. All the same, he went on, after a little pause, I still rather wish it all had ended differently. Differently? Were there other endings? I didn't want it to end without going to bed, he specified. Lenina was astonished. Not at once, not the first day, but then what? He began to talk a lot of incomprehensible and dangerous nonsense. Lenina did her best to stop the ears of her mind, but every now and then a phrase would insist and become audible. To try the effect of arresting my impulses, she heard him say. The words seemed to touch a spring in her mind. Never put off till tomorrow the fun you can have today, she said gravely. 200 repetitions twice a week from 14 to 16 and a half, was all his comment. Hold on, guys. The mad, bad talk rambled on. I want to know what passion is, she heard him say. When the individual feels, the community reels, Lenina pronounced. Well, why shouldn't it reel a bit? Bernard. But Bernard remained unabashed. Adults, intellectually, and during working hours, he went on, infants where feeling and desire are concerned. Our Ford loved infants. Ignoring the interruption, it suddenly struck me the other day, continued Bernard, that it might be possible to be an adult all the time. I don't understand. Lenina's tone was firm. I know you don't, and that's why we went to bed together yesterday, like infants, instead of being adults and waiting. But it was fun, Lenina insisted, wasn't it? Oh, the greatest fun, he answered, but in a voice so mournful, with an expression so profoundly miserable, that Lenina felt all her triumph suddenly evaporate. Perhaps he had found her too plump after all. I told you so, was all that Fanny said, when Lenina came and made her confidences. It's the alcohol they put in his surrogate. All the same, Lenina insisted, I do like him. He has such awfully nice hands, and the way he moves his shoulders, that's very attractive. She sighed. But I wish he weren't so odd. In the chat room at UCY.tv, thanks a lot for listening, guys. Del, Dan, Grump, Hopper, Lone Frog, Jane, Joe Friday, how you doing, buddy? Juana Taco, Matty Clues, Shirley Tomato, and 3 Anons. Thanks a lot for listening, everybody. Also check out the website reallibertymedia.com. It's a nice website to go to. And oh gosh.
The very
Also,
word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society.
Frida Lutza.
And we are, as a people,
So check
inherently
it out.
and historically
I'll be
opposed
back
to secret
next week,
societies,
and we'll
secret
continue
oaths,
this
and to secret proceedings.
brave new world.
I think
See
the
you
New
guys
World
next
Order
week.
is emerging.
Bye-bye.
An inside job? How dare you? How dare you?
To create, so to say, mass-produced models of human beings arranged in some kind
The Anti-Media Radio, your host Nick Burnaby here on UCY.